NETCAT is very similar to NCAT, and this is that program I was showing you guys gets installed whenever you install Nmap. So NCAT and NETCAT are used to bind a socket. What does that do? It says take a process like cmd.exe and tether it to port 80, tether it to 21. The cool thing about NETCAT is that it's both a client and a server. So if you're on a system, like let's say that I've got a server here, and I think this server might be compromised. I'm doing an investigation on it. And then over here, I've got my laptop. If I wanted to move files back and forth, I could use NETCAT to do it. And the reason that I say I could use NETCAT to do it is that I would run NETCAT on my laptop, and I'd run NETCAT on the server. When you run the NETCAT utility, you define what you want it to do. So I can say, I want you to behave as a server. I want you to behave as a client. I want you to perhaps take a file and transfer it over here to the laptop. NETCAT allows you to read and write across network sockets. So if I wanted to move a file from point A to point B, I could do that. I could also run a utility and take the output from that utility and redirect it to a TCP or UDP socket. So you know a lot of times if I run a utility, let's say like ls, when I say ls, I'm saying give me a directory listing. Well, whenever a tool like ls creates output, it gets sent to what's called standard out. And standard out is just your terminal. So if you're in a terminal session, like a DOS prompt, and you execute a command, the output from the command just comes back right there in your terminal window. Well, you can output the content, instead of sending it standard out, you could redirect it to a file. Has anybody ever done that before? It's a nice way to just take maybe a directory listing or a list of processes and write it out to a file instead of just printing it to standard out. So when you work with files, you can redirect. Instead of going to standard out, you could write the contents that are coming out of that application, and you could write it to a flat file, like processes.txt. And then you could do it in 10 minutes and call it processes2.txt, and then you compare the two text files. Another thing that you can do, instead of redirecting it to a file, is you can redirect it to NETCAT. So you could say, run this utility and take the contents from it and then sling it over here. One of the kind of weirdest things I've ever done with NETCAT was I was doing a forensic backup of a server that we thought was compromised, and I used a utility called DD. I don't know if any of you guys have used that before from Unix-based operating systems, but it's a bit-for-bit disk duplicator. So if I've got a hard drive and I think that there could be a rootkit on it and there's stuff that's hidden, I say don't copy all the files as you see it. Do an exact replica, block for block, of everything that's on this disk. And they go, where do you want to write it to? And I could actually write it to a network socket. And then on the other computer, I say use NETCAT, listen, do it on port 80. And whatever comes in through NETCAT, I want to output that to server.image. So I could actually write a bit-for-bit network, a bit-for-bit disk copy across a network from one computer to the next one using NETCAT. So NETCAT is super, super handy. I could use this as a client just to establish a connection to a remote server and enter some commands for banner grabbing. I could use to read and write data. I could use to make an interactive process. NETCAT is extremely, extremely useful. The downside to NETCAT is that it's clear text. So if you're moving sensitive data back and forth, an attacker could actually attack the attacker. But there's also another utility called CryptCat that EC Council wants you to be aware of. And that CryptCat is just NETCAT with encryption.